Thank you, Roberta. As she mentioned, it's a great pleasure to be here. My wife and I have been members of MICA for about 10 years now. It's a great experience. I'm sorry that Danny will not be here. It's my one regret here. Judge Tatel, I've always called David, of course, gave me a great honor today by asking me to be with him to ask questions about this incredible book, Vision. I've encouraged all of you to read it who have not had a chance, and Divided Politics and Prose, which is a very close place to David and me. Simply put, David Tatel is a true hero and legend in the civil rights field in this country, and was a giant of the law as a federal appeals court judge. For 30 years, this man was highly regarded as one of the best and most prominent liberal appellate court judges in this country. And as we all know how important that is in the world that we have found ourselves in today. David was nominated by Bill Clinton to be on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, taking Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat when she went to the Supreme Court. In his announcement, President Clinton lauded David, and I quote, his lifelong commitment to protecting and preserving the rights of all Americans, both private sector and in public service. I thought I'd briefly tell you something about David's public service before becoming a judge, because that will, I think, better inform you about some of the questions I will be asking David and some of his responses. Shortly after law school, David became the first head of the Chicago Lawyers Committee, which challenged racially discriminatory actions and policies in housing, education, and employment. David later became the director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law here in DC. Under his leadership, landmark lawsuits were filed and won across the country where there were injustices in employment, housing, finance, busing, and other abuses. In 1974, Congress created the Legal Services Corporation. David became its first general counsel. The Legal Services Corporation represented for many years individuals in a broad area where anywhere from domestic abuse to protecting consumers from predatory lending practices. Thereafter, during the Carter administration, David was chosen to head the Office of Civil Rights at HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. He had 1,000 investigators and attorneys working under him. While there, David led the way in challenging discriminatory practices in colleges, universities, and school districts throughout the country. After becoming a judge on the DC Circuit, David wrote more than 700 majority decisions and some 40 dissents. His decisions led the way in protecting the rights and liberties that all of us value. We're very indebted to Judge Tatel. Now, for our questions. My wife, Andy, and I have known Edie and David for almost 60 years. My first recollection of David was when I was a youngster in law school, when David taught a tax course. But I taught a tax course, which he later admitted he knew nothing about. Despite all of the times that we've spent with David Needy over the years, we never talked to him about his vision at all. David treated this as somewhat of a nuisance, as something that he had, something like a sore throat, and he managed. It was clear to Andy and me that David would have been very uncomfortable talking about this in any depth, so we never brought it up. After his book was published last June, the four of us were having dinner together at some restaurant. And I asked David, I said, David, what would you have thought at, say, 20 years ago? I'd ask you some in-depth questions, as close as we are and have been, about your vision, the challenges it represented. Edie quickly joined in and said, Bob, that could have been true 5 years ago. His answer to me was very direct. He said, Bob, I would have been very ticked off. Yet David wrote a very honest and telling book in which he described in great depth his blindness at all levels, beginning when he was first diagnosed as a teenager. So my question to you, David, is what led you to ultimately write your book and really deal with your vision issues throughout? What caused that?
Bob, I'm going to answer your question, I promise, but I want to say something first, which is, I've done a lot of book talks since this book came out. This one is especially wonderful for me because, as Bob said, he and Andy and Edie and I go way, way back. And it's really quite special, Bob, to have you do this. I hope you'll read the book, especially the acknowledgments where you will discover that Bob Adler is the captain of the Sandman, which appears in the book. We met in Ann Arbor, and it was a wonderful year. We were young, no kids. It was a really special year, and that's where we formed our friendship. So I am going to answer your question, Bob, but since not everybody has read the book, I'd like to just read, if it's okay, a passage from the prologue, which sets the stage for the book. And I hope will give you a sense of what I call the two braids of this book. I call it a braided memoir. And let me just read this, and then, Bob, I'll answer your question. I've lived a rich and varied life as a civil rights lawyer, as a federal judge, as a husband of 60 years, as a father of 4, as a grandfather of 8, and now as a great-grandfather. I've spent my professional career in the pursuit of justice. And I could have written a memoir entirely about that. But unlike most lawyers and judges, I've been blind for over half my life due to a rare inherited disease called retinitis pigmentosa. Throughout my 30 years on the nation's second highest court, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, I could neither read a word of the thousands of legal briefs submitted to my court, nor see the faces of the hundreds of lawyers who argued before me. A blind judge sounds like a cliche, I know, like the statue of Lady Justice wearing a blindfold and holding her scales, but it's no cliche to me. I can't see, but I can listen closely. I didn't need to see the lawyers to hear their argument, and I absorbed all the written materials by having them read to me or, later, by using digital audio devices. For decades, I fooled myself into thinking that my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now, in my 80s, and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. This memoir is about my life in the law and my journey into blindness. It's also about the Supreme Court and my grave concern about the state of our judiciary. So that's what the book's about. Now, so on to Bob's question. Why, after spending most of my life avoiding talking about sight, hiding it as much as I could. And throughout the book, you'll see lots of the techniques I learned for doing that. Why, after all these years, did I write this book? Well, when I started it, I actually didn't intend to get as personal in this book as I have. I thought when you wrote a memoir, you just started at the beginning and got to the end, and then you were done. But I had a very good editor who pushed me to deal with personal issues. Basically, what he said was, unless you deal with these issues, no one's going to read your book. And I also had a writing partner, my wife, Edie. Where are you? There she is. Who weighed in early in the process. And large parts of this book we wrote together. And in the process of writing, we discussed, we debated, we explored all kinds of issues that arose during our lifetime, centered around blindness, its effect on me, on Edie, on our marriage, and on our children. So by writing the book, the book is very much the coda, and I think I called that the book. The book is the coda to my personal adventure with this. It's the book that the more I talked about it, the more I discussed, the more I wrote, the more I got comfortable talking about blindness, and the more I began to understand that my book might actually be inspirational to people. There's a second reason why, and that's this beautiful German shepherd here named Vixen. I tell her story in the last chapter called The Dog That Changed My Life, which is not an overstatement. And Vixen, I didn't get Vixen until 5.5 years ago. Most of the time I use a mobility cane. Bob and I went on many runs and walks all over the place with my cane. He's seen it. And I was pretty good at it, but Vixen has given me a level of independence that I never had. And Edie also. But the reason Vixen's important to this is that, you know, when I'm walking around, standing on a corner, trying to cross the street, and with a mobility cane, nobody comes up to you and says, "Hey, how are you going to get across the street?" Or, "That's really cool. How do you use it?" But if you have a guide dog, they all want to talk about the dog. And you can't have a guide dog and be uncomfortable talking about blindness. It just doesn't work. And so Vixen has opened up a whole world to me in terms of my comfort in dealing with this. Now, you know, this is a memoir. Edie and I worked very hard on it. There's a lot in here. There's a lot also, Bob, to be candid, that's not in here. You know, we were comfortable sharing what we shared, but we didn't share everything. And but still, you know, it's the writing of the book and the presence of Vixen in my life that really, I think, answers your question.
Thank you. David, in your book, you wrote that there were things that what you were bringing out, which you had never, ever shared with Edie.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah. Yes. So, as I said, just picture this. We have a very long desk. Edie's seat is at the left. Mine's at the right. I don't know, 10 feet. And she has her computer and I have my computer. And the way we worked was, you know, I would draft stuff and send it to Edie. And Edie would work on it and send it back to me. And we would discuss that. Or we would go on a walk and talk about things we were going to put in the book or not put in the book. Also, as I wrote this book, I wrote a lot of what we call blurbs, little paragraphs, pages, just randomly. We put them all in a Google Doc. And Edie would react to those. I would always send those to you. Well, it was through this writing process that Edie discovered a number of things that I had really never told her. Some of them I think were funny. Some of them weren't so funny. For example, I don't know. Were you in the tax class I taught at Michigan? Were you there? Okay, yeah, you were there. I taught one class on the charitable tax deduction, section 501c3, right? Okay, I was teaching 100 and how many people?
A lot of,
Yeah, 150. So you have to call on people. Well, I couldn't see them to call them. So I worked really hard and created this chart with a big black marker. I could still see big letters. And I had this chart, which I took in the class, spread out on the desk in front of me, and I could call on people. Well, Edie had never heard that story. She learned that while we were writing this book. There are lots of stories like that. I'll just tell you one more. You know, so when we first came to Washington, I wasn't using a cane at all, and I took the L7 bus. Remember the L7? I bet a lot of people who used to take the L7 bus, right? And when I come home, if it was dark, I could see the label above, the sign, where it said Chevy Chase Circle L7, because it was lit up. But during the day, I couldn't see. So sometimes I would wait a half an hour for the sun to go down before I come home. Well, I wrote that and sent it on to Edie, and I heard from the other end of the desk, "You did what?" It took a week, I think. I'm not sure, Edie, that he's still completely accepted us, or whether I've accepted how silly that was. But the point of all this is that we learned a lot about each other in writing the book. Let me just read you one more excerpt from the book, because this is another passage that we massaged for months. And this is a story of when I first told Edie about my eyesight. Remember, I was diagnosed when I was 15 years old, and I met Edie when I was 23 and she was 22. So we're talking about 8 years. So, and I had all these techniques for hiding my sight from my friends at home. So no one knew about it at all. Here's the answer. At first, I kept up the same ruse with Edie as I did with everyone else. But as we grew closer, I soon began to worry about when and how I'd tell her that something was wrong with my eyes. I thought long and hard about what to say and when to say it. So I remember the conversation well. One sunny afternoon, as we walked hand in hand around the 55th Street point, a peninsula jutting out into Lake Michigan, we wandered over to one of the big cement blocks, sat down, and listened to the waves. "I need to tell you something," I began, and describe what I had learned, or at least what I had chosen to hear from Dr. Burson 7 years earlier. Now it was Edie's turn to decide what she wanted to do. Looking back on it, Edie thinks I told her that although my vision would decline over time, that blindness was theoretically possible. It was all uncertain and a long, long way off. Edie was the very first person in whom I confided. I remember the huge feeling of relief that washed over me when she told me it was okay. Of course, neither of us knew what we were getting into. Remember, Edie didn't meet a blind man. She met a man who looked and functioned like a sighted person, who read thick law books, rode a bike, and shopped at a grocery store. How, at the start of a blossoming relationship, was she supposed to process the news that someday my life and hers might be very different? With that elephant off my chest, we got back to the all-engaging business of falling in love.
thank you, David. David, in your book, you describe a session which meeting you had with Rabbi Holzblatt at Addis Israel, where you went to learn about how the Old Testament dealt with blindness. You wrote in your book that the answer you found was better than what you had hoped. Rabbi Holzblatt pointed you to Leviticus, which commanded, quote, before the blind, thou shalt not place a stumbling block. You wrote in your book that what this meant to you was that the sighted have a responsibility to clear the way for the blind, both literally and metaphorically. Can you tell us, what happened a few minutes after you left Rabbi Holzblatt?
Yes, so we spent the whole morning with the rabbi poring over text because we really wanted to learn about blindness in the Old Testament. Anyway, so the story is after learning this great quote from Leviticus, which is in the book, we left and I called an Uber. No, I'm sorry, a Lyft. And the Lyft driver showed up, and Vixen, when you open a car door, Vixen hops in. Actually, she usually sits in the driver's seat. She gets in, and this driver went nuts. And I don't know how many of you know this, but it's a real problem for blind people with guide dogs with Uber and Lyft. A lot of the drivers will not allow the dog in the car, and it's very unpleasant. They are legally required to carry the dog, and Uber and Lyft all the regulations required. But these people, I think a study showed that 25% of the time people with guide dogs get rejected. So this guy went nuts. And Edie, who's always, my response is to get really annoyed at the guy. Edie, of course, her reaction is totally different from mine, which is, okay, I'm going to explain to this man what the law is and why he has to take my husband and his guide dog. Well, even Edie couldn't convince this guy. And he got out of the car and he was screaming. Anyway, I finally got out. It was humiliating. It was humiliating. This guy didn't know who he was messing with, because I went back to the courthouse and called my friends at the Washington Post. And a week later, some of you may remember this headline, banner headline: Lyft driver rejects federal judge and his guide dog. So, then I get a call from some big shot at Lyft. Oh, we're terrible with you. Will you please meet with our people? So they sent over a delegation of people to talk to me. I'd say I met with them 2 or 3 times. Nothing ever came of it. The situation with Lyft and Uber is just as bad as ever for blind people. And, for me, I was with Edie. So I didn't have a problem. She just drove me to the courthouse. But most blind people who have these experiences are alone. And I've talked to many people who, they're waiting for an Uber because they've got a plane to catch, and the Uber driver drives past when he sees a dog. I don't think Uber and Lyft will ever. Actually, the answer to this is last month, Edie and I were in California, and one of our grandsons took us into San Francisco to ride in a Waymo, driverless. They take guide dogs. No problem.
Thank you, David. All right. David, one of the later chapters in your book is the future of democracy. The world has obviously changed since President Trump took office in January. In your chapter, you explained that your concerns were about the Supreme Court. You wrote, quote, while my court was protecting, meaning the Court of Appeals, were protecting the statutory rights of people with disabilities, the Supreme Court began to soon eviscerate those rights. You also wrote, quote, anyone concerned with the environment or safe medicines, unadulterated food, or cars that can drive safely with very good reason need to be worried where the Supreme Court is headed. given Trump's executive orders and other efforts to evade due process, ignore court orders, and attack judges who ruled against him, how would you write that chapter today on the future of democracy in this country?
That's a really, really good question. And the answer, Bob, is that I would write that chapter, The Future of Democracy, and the preceding chapter, The Future of Our Planet, very, very different. In those two chapters, I explain how our current Supreme Court has weakened our environmental laws by weakening the agencies that enforce them. And in The Future of Democracy, the chapter Bob was talking about, I explain how the court has steadily eviscerated perhaps the most important and effective civil rights law ever passed, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I explain how the court has done that by disregarding the Constitution, statutes, its own precedent, and steadily, 5-4 decision by 5-4 decision, expanded its own power at the expense of the other two branches of government. And the threat to democracy that I describe in the book is the threat to the separation of powers, with the unelected judiciary assuming more and more powers from the two political branches of government. Today, I would keep the titles of the chapters the same. They would still be called The Future of Our Planet and The Future of Our Democracy. But the threat is now from the President of the United States. It's still from the courts. The Supreme Court, even this year, is continuing its effort to weaken the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And we don't have the final decision in the Alabama, Louisiana redistricting case, but from the oral argument, I'm deeply concerned that the court might use this case to eviscerate the sort of last protection from the Voting Rights Act. But those threats pale in significance to what this president is doing. In terms of the two areas we've talked about, whereas the courts were weakening the agencies that protect the environment, Trump is destroying the agencies and their ability to protect the environment. And although the president of the United States has no constitutional power at all over voting, his executive order tries to institute nationwide changes in voting that will severely limit the ballot. So the big question in my mind, Bob, is I now don't worry about, or I don't worry as much about the court assuming powers it doesn't have. I worry now about whether the court will resist the president's effort to assume powers he doesn't. Whether the court will resist Trump's efforts to exert powers that belong to Congress and that belong only to the courts. We could talk much more about this if you like, but the first indications about this are not promising. In the last 5 days, just 5 days, we've had 3 Supreme Court decisions on what's called the shadow docket, where the court doesn't hear oral argument or receive full briefing. And in all 3 of those cases, it gave the president pretty much what he wanted. In one of the cases, where a district court had enjoined the Department of Education from suspending grants, millions of dollars of grants for teacher education, the Supreme Court reversed that and allowed the Trump administration to suspend those things. In the case everybody's read about this week, the Alien Enemies Act case, the court vacated a district court temporary restraining order which prohibited the president from deporting hundreds of alleged members of a Venezuelan gang. And in the third case, which was yesterday, a district court had ordered the rehiring of thousands and thousands of probationary employees. The court reversed that also. And in each of these cases, the court used more or less procedural or technical reasons for avoiding, prohibiting the president from implementing his initiatives. In the education grants case, the court said, well, these people should have gone to the Court of Claims. In the Alien Enemies Act case, the court said they should have filed habeas petitions in Texas, not a class action in Washington. And in the case involving the firing of thousands of probationary employees, they said the plaintiffs lacked standing. That is, they didn't have the injury that entitled them to come to court. Now, there was one thing in the Alien Enemy Act case. All 9 justices agreed that these individuals were entitled to some sort of due process, that is, a hearing, where they could at least argue that that they weren't members of the gang. And that's important. You know, it's important not. I mean, I didn't think that was very hard, to be honest, but I think it's important that all 9 members of the court agree with that. Now, whether they agree that that would allow people to actually challenge the application of the Alien Enemies Act or not, we just don't know. We don't know what this means. But my point, Bob, is that what we've seen so far is a court, I guess I would call it leaning over backwards to avoid challenging the president. First of all, these are 3 cases that didn't have to be. These are all early in the process. And there's an elaborate appellate, many of you are probably lawyers. These cases are just, this is at the very beginning of this litigation. There was really no reason for the court to decide any of these cases. And if you read the dissents, Jackson and Sotomayor, I mean, that's what they're complaining about. And secondly, the court used these procedural objections to find a way to avoid directing the president to essentially. So I don't think it's. I'm worried, but you know, we have to see what happens on the merits, and there are more of these cases to come down, and every case has to look. Has to look at every case individually, but the pattern is not constant.
All right, thank you, David. David, in an executive order, President Trump shut down DEI programs, federal agencies, and set in motion the firing of federal workers who had done DEI work. A memo sent by the federal government to education offices across the country asked that they confirm that they had eliminated all programs which promoted DEI and further threatened the withdrawal of federal funding to significant if they did not comply. As is well known, the goal of DEI initiatives, both in the federal government and throughout the country, is to advance the representation of different races, genders, and classes, as well as people with disabilities and other protected groups. This, needless to say, is a cause to which you have dedicated your entire life. What are your views, David, of these extraordinary actions taken by President Trump?
Well, this isn't the first time in our country that we've seen this show. You know, Richard Nixon ran on his, quote, Southern strategy to roll back civil rights protections. President Reagan did the same thing. What we're seeing today, those efforts dwarf in comparison to what we're seeing today. The president is using this opposition to DEI to roll back the heart of the civil rights protections. in our country. And they're, in my mind, my view, completely false. The president, after the Harvard affirmative action case, prohibited use of race in admissions, the executive branch has the authority to enforce that in colleges and universities around the country. And colleges and universities have to obey it. It's the law of the land. But that decision says nothing about what Trump is trying to accomplish. It doesn't authorize him to eliminate programs of this kind. It doesn't authorize him to try to direct curriculum in colleges and universities. The Harvard case, which they keep citing, was a situation where Asian students were harmed by universities who took race into account. There's no harm that flows from any of the programs he's shutting down. These are programs to promote diversity for everybody. Now, are they going to get litigated? Yes. There's two big problems with these, Bob. One is procedural. They just don't have the authority under federal laws to just suddenly terminate these funds. There's a procedure for them. And the universities and school boards who are the targets have an opportunity to defend themselves. And secondly, so that's number one. And secondly, the courts, I suspect the lower federal courts will probably rule that most of these DEI efforts are beyond the president's authority. And then we'll have to see what happens in the Supreme Court.
Thank you, David. The federal government, as we all know, has recently deported numerous migrants to El Salvador, where they have been incarcerated for an indefinite period of time in inhumane conditions without any due process whatsoever. Can you give us your thoughts of this utter lack of due process, the harm it does to this country and those living in it?
Well, I've already explained what the court did. It did say that they're entitled to due process. I mean, if you think about, or as I think about, what makes American values unique? What is it that's special about our country and our constitutional system? One of them has to be the concept of due process. That the government can't take action against anyone without due process. You can't grab people off the streets. The government can't incarcerate people. The government can't deport people without giving everybody, every target, opportunity to prove their case. I mean, I can't think of anything that's more fundamentally American than that. Now, in this case, involving the Venezuelan Venezuelans living in this country who were just deported, the Supreme Court has said, yes, they do, but they have to file it. They have to raise an individual habeas case. In other words, they can't come to court and say, as they did, that the government is involved in a pattern of deporting people who meet these requirements. It's a pattern. They can't come to court and say, you need to block the administration from doing that. They say, you have to bring these individually in cases. Well, you know, habeas is one of the most powerful powerful tools federal courts have, but it dramatically weakens the ability of the courts to resist what the president is doing if it has to be brought in individual habeas cases where the relief is actually quite a bit narrower than the court can order. So, as I said, Bob, you know, it's possible. I suppose it's possible that the court will interpret the due process it talked about last week robustly and require serious hearings before anybody can be deported. If they do that, then I think the damage here will be limited. But I doubt very much that. All
right, thank you. David, throughout your book, you give well-deserved praise and loving admiration to your wife, Edie, who helped you, as you noted, write your book. Here's my question, David. How were you able, over the years, to balance your demanding career, long hours as a leading civil rights attorney, later as a judge, on the one hand, with your roles as husband, father, and grandfather on the other hand?
Good question, Bob.
You don't have to answer.
I think maybe the answer is I probably didn't balance it as well as I should have, but I was fortunate. We were fortunate that, you know, Edie and I married in the 60s, started having children in the 60s and 70s, when wives stayed at home and took care of the house and the kids. The husbands went to work. I was fortunate to have to be developing a career and dealing with blindness at that time. And how it would have worked if we were talking about the 1990s and we were both partners in law firms, I think that would have been much more of a challenge. But also, you know, I was very fortunate to not only have a, you know, unbelievably supportive wife and family, but the institutions that I worked at were also extremely supportive. You know, they were it's a very interesting point. They were all, I worked at, you know, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, worked at a law firm, worked at OCR, and everybody there was like Bob, in the sense that they knew I had this visual disability, but everybody respected my desire not to talk about it. But that doesn't mean they weren't helpful in many ways. And you know, when I finally disclosed it in 1980, not 1980, whatever it was that 1980, when I left HEW, I was then running the office of rights, went back to the firm, to Hogan. I knew that, you know, I needed to tell them that I was going to leave the site. I mean, they wanted me to come there and be a partner, and I wanted to, but I really had to disclose it. And I tell a story in the book. I mean, their reaction was, well, what do you need? You know, they didn't ask any questions. They didn't probe at all. I say in the book, they didn't even seem to feel sorry for me. They just said, well, what do you need? And that's what they did the entire time I was there, and I'm still there. And so I say this only because, you know, I've been very fortunate to be in very supportive environments. That is not true of huge numbers of people with disabilities. Do not take my story as a typical story. I know, we've made a lot of progress in our country. First with the Rehabilitation Act, and now with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We made a lot of progress, but there's still a very long way to go. And I can't tell you how many emails and letters I get from law students who are struggling, blind law students who are struggling in their institutions to get the support they need. So we still have.
David, we can't very well end this discussion without letting you tell us about Vixen. As you mentioned, the last chapter in your book is The Dog Who Changed My Life. Can you tell us about Vixen and how Vixen changed your life?
Yes. I have I say in the book, there's a sign on my desk which says, Edie got it for me. She got it, I think, it says, ask me about my dog. So, Bob, you asked. As I said, for 40 years, I used the mobility kit. I was pretty good at it. You know, you and I went lots of places, right? And I never really thought seriously about getting a guide. People would ask, and I never took it seriously, mainly because I had this unbelievably supportive environment I lived in. You know, I had 4 law clerks and a sister and a family, and you know, it's not like I, you know, was struggling. But the cane, traveling with a cane, I found there's a lot of saying and thinking while you're using it because you have to pay attention to the sounds and where you are. And, I was feeling kind of constrained. And at about that time, our then 11-year-old grandson showed up one day with a podcast that he wanted me to listen to, and it was about guide dogs. And I listened to it with him, and at the end of it, one of the other reasons why I never really thought seriously about a guide dog is that most of the guide dog breeding and training programs, they have these really lovely facilities where you have to go live there for a month to learn to use the dog. And that was, there wasn't any way I was going to fit that into my work at the court. Go away for a month and a half to live with a bunch of dogs. That wasn't going to happen. But at the end of this podcast, they said, if you're too busy, we'll bring the dog to you. So I asked Edie what she thought, and she thought that was interesting to try to pursue it. So make a long story short, we applied to a program in Connecticut called the Tatel Guide Dog Foundation. And it's like all of the other programs around the country, except its theory is to train you where you live. They don't even have a facility. They bring the dog to you. And they only do German Shepherd, like this. And by the way, getting a guide dog, it's like applying to college. I mean, I needed 3 references. I needed a doctor's report. I needed financial reports. They make home visits. It's really intensive. Anyway, we got approved, and 5.5 years ago, on a lovely day, a man pulled up in a van and out popped this beautiful then 2-year-old German Shepherd. And I spent the next 2 weeks in what I think was the hardest thing I've ever done to learn to work with her. She was fully trained. I wasn't. And it was intense. And there were moments when I thought I was going to fail. I really didn't think I could do it. But it began to work and click, and I began to understand what she was doing. And most important, she learned to trust me. And the result is dramatic because both, you talk about the independence you get from a guide dog. But the fact is that we both have this newfound level of independence because all the things that Edie used to have to do in my movement, she doesn't have to do anymore because Vixen does all that. Vixen and I go back and forth to the office on the metro. Vixen loves this escalator thing. And we live most of the time in the country. We love to walk. But now, if I want to go walking and Edie wants to garden or something, Vixen and I just go off and do our walk. So the point is that we both have this wonderful level of independence that neither of us ever had. And as I said at the beginning, Vixen has made me, is one of the reasons why I'm finally come to terms with this blindness, and I'm comfortable sitting at an event like this talking to a lot of people I don't know about blindness, which I would not have done 5 years ago, that's for sure. And also, she's a great dog. We really love her, and she loves us, and she's a wonderful addition to our family.
All right, thank you, David. Well, that's all that I had. Are there other questions?
David, I'm Sid Ruth, and I schlepp the microphone around here to people who have questions for you. And in this format, I will identify them. And each of us should give you our names so you know you're speaking to. I take the privilege of asking you this question. I've read for blind people for many years, and it went through the experience you mentioned of the training away from home that goes on for a month or a month and a half. The attachment of my friends to his dog was off the charts. I also learned that the lifespan of a dog in this kind of work, and maybe it was only this breed, which was a lab, was relatively short, 4 or 5 working years, maybe longer, and then the dogs are free to live the dog's life, and you have to start over. Is that part of what you understand?
Well, people have different views about this. Yeah, dogs can't work forever. This is not a topic I especially enjoy talking about, honestly, but people, I've asked Fidelco about this, and they've seen Vixen in the operation. They say, you guys are doing great, just keep it up. I think the average, as best I can tell, is guide dogs seem to retire when they're 10 or 11 or maybe 12. Some retire earlier if they develop problems. But, I think Vixen and I still have many working years together, right, Vixen?
Yeah.
So,
Hi, I'm Harriet Kinberg. Thank you so much, Judge Tate, and thank you, Bob. Judge, what is your advice to law firms who are being threatened? What are the practical things you think they should be doing to turn this around?
well, we have two models that we can look at. We have the New York model, which are law firms that have simply given in to Trump and accepted limitations on what they can do and promised to set aside hundreds of millions of dollars of pro bono help on issues the president wants. That's one model. The other model is several Washington law firms, Perkins and its lawyers, Williams and Connolly, Wilmer, Cutler and Wilmer, Hale and Dorr, Wilmer, Cutler. That's just the old, right? Wilmer, Hale and Jenner. That's the other model. They sued. I mean, that's my answer to your question. The legal profession, law firms specifically in the legal profession generally, are absolutely essential to the separation of powers. The courts cannot function without lawyers. Lawyers are the people's access to the courts. And any effort to intimidate lawyers is profoundly unconstitutional and dangerous. And we have one group of law firms that has stepped up to the plate and fought, and we have another group that has chosen not to. And I'm afraid they're going to be more and more in the latter category over the next few days. I'm fairly confident. I hate to make predictions, but I'm fairly confident that the law firms that sued will win their cases. Even in, well, I probably shouldn't say this. Even in the Supreme Court of the United States, I think they will win their cases.
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. We're talking about the United States, but I'd like to expand this to Europe if you're following legal developments there. And we have some increasingly authoritarian governments there. Hungary is often cited. In terms of the legal professions, let's say in Europe, what are you seeing or hearing about their work in defending civil liberties, in pushing back against increasingly authoritarian developments? Are there lessons we can learn here as we struggle with Mr. Trump and his acolyte?
Well, I do know one story I'll mention, but our legal systems here are very different from legal and judicial systems in Europe. The judges in most European countries are professional career judges. It's a career track, and they're picked on a nonpartisan basis. In our country, the federal judicial system, the appointment of judges is a political process, and sadly, the process is becoming more and more political. And unfortunately, that's happening at the state level too. See what just happened in Wisconsin and what's happening in North Carolina. I saw a really interesting interview the other day. David French, the columnist of the Times, he interviewed, he had this really interesting interview. I think it's on, I'm sure it's online, of judges in Poland. And he describes the role they play in resisting the authoritarian Polish government and restoring the democracy they now have. And according to French, and these people he interviewed, these judges spent years, 2 or 3, 4 years in their communities educating the public, talking to community groups, to individuals about the rule of law. And, and it was really fascinating to me to see how the judicial system in these countries in Poland, which, face the kind of threat we have now, but has largely moved beyond it, the role they play. It's very hard to translate that to this because our political system is so politicized at this point.
Hi, Judge Tatel. This is Jerry. And I have a question from the Zoom audience from Peg Blackman. And she wants to know, where did you get your interest in law and civil and in civil rights?
Yes. So my father was a scientist and I was to be a scientist. And in fact, I went off to the University of Michigan majoring in science, physics, and engineering. But it was the 1960s. And I was captured by the 60s and the civil rights movement mainly, and the Kennedy administration. And I was watching I was just totally enthralled with the role the Justice Department was playing in the South, and the role of Southern judges. And within a year, I've never left science behind. I love it. It's a big part of my life, but I decided I wanted a different kind of life, and I switched to political science and then went to law school. And at least for me, the rest is history. But it was the 60s. It was the 1960s. Edie and I we like to say, let me say the book, we are very much children of the 60s. The values of the 60s, focus on equity and fairness. And we were very much a part of the movements of the 60s. The civil rights movement and the women's movement and the environmental movement, anti-war movement. I'll bet there's a lot of people in this room who came out of the same roots, right? Yeah, and right, and that's not it. I was captured by the 1960s. Lucky me.
I have a question in a minute, as long as I get over there.
Question.
You're going to ask me to ask me to wait. I'm Ava Abramowitz, and I am a groupie, and I have been to every one that you have done in Washington, D.C. Why haven't you asked Bob how to do it with you before? This is the best.
You have to know that Ava is my cousin, so she likes all of these. Yeah. So now I want to say something. You may have heard, we finished this book 2 years ago, but Edie has still not stopped rewriting. And she just asked me to explain about the Kennedys and their impact on them. And it wasn't just civil rights. It was the notion of public service. I mean, it sounds so old fashioned, but you go back and listen to what John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were saying in the 60s about public service. And it's A, thrilling, and B, sad that it's now become, it's looked down upon. But those speeches of the Kennedys had enormous influence on me. I was very lucky. I was a sophomore or junior in college, Michigan. The Kennedys, nobody has written about this. I wish somebody would do a book about this. They invited, I think, 10,000 college students around the country. Every summer, they gave us jobs. I was a GS5 economist, if you can believe it, at the Labor Department. And my friends were Justice in the Defense Department, the Commerce Department. We were all over the government. There were 10,000 of us. In June, at the beginning of the summer, we went to the South Lawn of the White House, where we were greeted by the President of the United States, who said to us, "There's nothing more noble than public service." And then throughout the summer, we went every week. They gave us a token to go to Uline Arena. How many here know what Uline Arena is? Huh? Yep. Okay. Where we heard from a member of the cabinet, Kennedy, Russ, all of them, same message, public service. At the end of the summer, back to the White House, President of the United States thanks us for our service. No wonder I have the career I'm doing. I mean, it was formative for me and for my huge parts of my generation. were greatly influenced by the Kennedys' devotion to public service.
Hi, I'm Amy Schulzheim, and I can't tell you how much I've learned and appreciated your talk today. I was a social worker at the old and the new Walter Reed for many years, and we used dogs to help soldiers with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and the amputees. And so one of the things I love is to have somebody talk about the importance of these dogs for many different kinds of disabilities. In fact, when I lost a patient, they would bring a dog to me to cuddle. So they used them with the staff at Walter Reed. So my question is the I in the DEI, which is about inclusion of people with disabilities. I mean, what is the threat to special ed and accessibility to buildings and to transportation? I mean, everybody, this DEI people are thinking, oh, it has to do with race. Well, it's much broader than that. And I'd like to know how you see that this affecting people with disabilities.
Well, I'm really glad you said that. That's a really, really good point. And I don't know the answer to the question. I just cannot imagine, just like you, I cannot imagine why anybody, even if you worry about the excessive use of race and gender, that's a legitimate concern, right? It's a legitimate point of discussion. How much at this time in our history should we be allowing race and gender and other factors like that to be taken into account in various situations? That's a legitimate debate. But like you, I don't get this closing down of programs for including disabled people in the world. That makes no sense to me. To me, it's just cruel. There's no other word I can think of for it than just plain cruel.
Seeing no more hands, I'll take the privilege again to ask Mrs. Sitbrook. What are you hearing among colleagues in the legal profession about those firms that have gone over the dark side, shall we say? And what can be done about it?
A lot. I have lots of law clerks throughout the legal system. I've been on the phone for weeks with this stuff. I'm not involved in it, but I am talking to lots of people about it. I think the blowback to the New York firms is going to be severe when it comes to recruiting. I think they're going to find that the best and the brightest, unless they're Trump supporters, aren't going to come to this office. I know young associates, young partners are deeply worried about their firms. I just got a text message from someone who said the leading partner in Wilkie Farr, that's one of the firms that struck a deal with Trump, today resigned in protest for what his firm has done. So I think the blowback is going to be serious in terms of recruiting. Unfortunately, I don't think it will be, I don't think any big client's going to say for them, oh, we really wish you would sit up to Trump, so we're going to go fight. I don't know, that's just not the way the system works. Excuse me. But I think these firms will and should suffer in the recruitment process. Now, there's two different recruiting systems in these law schools. And there are a lot of young conservatives who are supportive of Trump, and they'll go look for themselves. So it'll change the character of the institution today. And here's one of the worst things about it to me. Take Paul Weiss. When I ran the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law in the 70s, Paul Weiss was one of the firms we went to for our biggest, most controversial cases. Paul Weiss took on some very difficult cases that involved their lawyers going to Mississippi and Alabama in situations that it wasn't safe. They were fabulous. And now it's a tragedy.
Judge, we want to thank you for a fabulous presentation, and Bob as well. We could be